Welcome everybody to the fourth annual UniCon. Many have copied what we do and the purple teaming, not naming names, Attack IQ. Um, but we are the first, we are the original, and we are happy that you, the community, enjoy what we do so much that others want to do it too. So spread the love, I guess, is the best piece to do that. So John, where are you calling in from?
I'm actually, I can give you a quick tour. I bought a hospital.
Of course you did.
Yeah. So this was a medical center. I'm currently in one of the refurbished rooms. This is the new offices for a security operations center, and we're going to go to a medical, like, let's go to an examination room. How does that sound? Or I can show you the obscenely large toilet that's here. But no, we got this like hospital medical center for dirt cheap, and we're renovating the whole thing. So like you have like, see, that's just ridiculous. Just a monster toilet.
You
Uh,
just created a meme picture right there.
right
That's
there.
frame,
That's what we got.
freeze frame on that picture is it going to be a meme?
Yep. And then I have this other area really, really cool where I have these awesome lights that I can turn on, maybe. I don't know. But no, it's just a really, really kind of cool building that we were able to get for cheap. It's got Cat 6 wiring through the entire thing.
All right. Well, we lost you in the building, John. So maybe
Oh,
maybe
well,
maybe stick where the Wi-Fi works.
we should be coming back now. All right. Can you hear me?
All right. Well, while John's coming back online, again, welcome to UniCon. This is our fourth annual one. So grateful for all of you who participate and all of the speakers throughout the day. Some things to let you know. We are going to be running a raffle.
I like at this point how Bryson thinks it's me that got frozen. And I wonder how far he's going to monologue thinking it was me that was frozen, when in fact, it was his crappy Wi-Fi. So on behalf of Bryson, while he's frozen, I want to take a few moments and I want to welcome you all to UniCon 2023. Absolutely fantastic conference. Bryson is like crazy connected with all of these different people in the industry, which I just think is fantastic to bring them all here and to give you some of the best offensive and defensive talks that you can possibly get on your interweb, intertube things, however the pipes are coming and going in and out of your organization. I don't have a problem with bandwidth at my hospital. Bryson apparently has problems with his bandwidth, and I'm rubbing it in because if you don't know, historically, I live out in the middle of the woods and my internet is just like absolutely bad and has been for 10 years. And Bryson's let me know that it's really bad and it's been like bad for a number of years. But now with him in Florida, he should have great internet and he doesn't have good internet. So what we're going to do, this is kind of set up from the perspective, it was meant to, we call it being ranty. And we're going to kind of leave it as, let's say, an ask me anything. And when Bryson comes back in, he will also be answering some of these questions. And we're going to answer your questions as straightforward as we possibly can. Some of that may be a little bit dicey on some of our opinions on things, because if you've been around Bryson or myself, we have no freaking filters. We're trying to swear less, because it's a kid's show at UniCon 2023. But we're really going to try to share with you our experience in areas. Everything's been fine. Everything's been fine in your absence.
Yeah. So let me quick do some housekeeping, and then we'll get started with the rants
Please carry
until
on.
some nation state knocks me out again.
Pipe
Um,
envy, by the way, is the hashtag for this conference now.
what's our hashtag?
Pipe envy, because we were
Pipe
talking about
envy.
pipes and data pipes and things
Okay.
like that.
Okay. Again, fourth annual Unicon. Welcome to all of you who helped make this what it is. We have a raffle today. So for all of you registered attendees, um, submit your questions. We will have a Q&A behind each speaker. And if you are selected, so you have to put in a good question, just bad questions will not get selected. So it has to be a good question. So we will be doing quality control, but registered attendees, and of course, it's important that we can actually recognize your name to your registration. So you should put in your name so we can figure out who you are. you will win a Scythe board game. So for all of you who aren't aware, yes, the game Scythe, which has nothing to do with our Scythe, is a really cool tactical strategy game. I played it a few years ago. There's a little bit of a steep learning curve, but it's a lot of fun. Easy once you get up. It's got some interesting dynamics to play with other folks. John, sounds like
And
you have something on the board game.
I was going to say, in addition to that board game, I will throw in a full set of backdoors and breaches cards, like the expansion pack, the Huntress pack. We'll throw that into just kind of sweeten the pot a little bit.
Maybe that'll be one of the packs where it has me as a consultant.
That's no. Remember, we were saving you for the dark expansion, the offensive expansion. That deck we are currently working on. We've got to come up with at least 36 cards that'll be offensive and competitive. We're saving you for that. So,
Okay. Well,
yep.
so stay tuned. You will win a Scythe board game, and you will win from Black Hills Information Systems a backdoor and breaches game. If you haven't played it, it is a really cool way to do education and training around incident response.
Your burgers.
Yeah. So really excited for that. So, John, anything else we need to do to level set, or do we jump
I
into
think
it?
we got it. I think we got it. It's got to be good questions. We aren't going to we aren't going to try to rant. We're going to try to answer the questions with best in our ability. Because I know whenever people try to rant, Bryson, sometimes they get forced and it just seems awkward. And we want this to happen naturally. So let's go
Yeah.
ahead.
So throw questions in there. We're not going to have a dedicated Q&A. We will decide to include which questions we like as we go, and this will be a community talk together. Well, let's start off with, of course, the space that we're in. So we've been lumped into what's called breach and attack simulation because that's the way Gartner and Forrester work. And I'll tell you, it's been kind of difficult for us because we don't really fit with what other folks are doing in that space. But John, you're outside of it. You're adjacent to it. You compete with it somewhat as a consultant, sort of like what I had to do at Grimm. What are your thoughts?
So so one of the things that's coming down right now is the level of complexity in information security has always been a thing. It's always been a problem, right? And especially whenever you're looking at offensive security and looking at an organization, that complexity is becoming more and more of a problem. And what I mean by that is most engagements, whenever you're doing offensive security, you have a very fixed amount of time for traditional red team type engagements. And one of the things that we used to kind of fight was there ain't nothing that's going to automate me. I'm going to use my pickaxe, and there's no way that this like the steam engine thing can beat me. And we got that whole Jack Henry moment. But we're really truly getting to the point where there are so many different offensive tactics and so many offensive techniques that you need to go through as part of an offensive security assessment that you can't do them all manually by hand. It's just absolutely getting to the point where it's impossible for like an assumed compromise assessment. And when we're looking at the vulnerability management space, like Nessus and Rapid7 and all those tools that are out there, they're not even touching like all the vulnerabilities that exist post compromise. So we've got this huge need for some level of automation in the industry for people to do a comprehensive job. Doing it bespoke by hand is just not possible. And I know that you're going to hear some people that'll be like, well, I'm elite hacker from back in the day and I can do it by hand. They're lying and they're full of crap. You can't. There's so much that you need to test for. Also with other organizations, there's, when you're getting into this, are we going to call it breach and attack simulation? Are we just going to call it BAS? Because whatever. I really wish.
I mean, Baz is what it is. I mean, loosely speaking, it's because it's supposed to be post compromise, so post breach, hence the breach part, and then attack simulation because theoretically they are simulating an attack.
Okay. All right. So BAS. So we're going to go ahead and we'll stick on that. So I think that it's important. We need that type of automation. Where we're running into the problem is a lot of the vendors out there are saying we can automate an entire pen test. People like Pentera, because we're going to get salty. That are like, we can automate an entire pen test. We can do it cheaper. We can do all of these things. I think what they do is important. I think that it's incredibly important to do BAS type things. But whenever you have a company that's like flat out saying that we're replacing an entire pen test, they're missing the goddamn point. And that's kind of, we can get into some additional questions based on that. But that's kind of my take as somebody that does offensive all the time. We need this automation to do our jobs effectively moving forward. Companies need this automation because it's a huge blind spot that their vulnerability management products aren't doing. But no, we got to stay away from snake oil salesmen that say that it can completely replace an entire section of the pen testing community.
So I'm gonna start with, I think, two things it does well. Because I think you have part of what you talked about, which is the traditional red team, right? The traditional red team was not necessarily business focused. I'm going to run off. I'm going to do crazy things. I'm going to show up after 2 to 4 weeks, throw a thick report at you, assuming it's a good report and not a Nessus scan. Hey, congratulations, go fix all this stuff. I'll see you in a year. Um,
Yep.
the second part of that is the fact that your configurations, your security is constantly changing. And
Mm,
so a pen test or a red team, even if they're really good, are a snapshot in time. And so that continuous understanding is critical. Where I think the wires have been crossed, and we can argue that this is marketing, we can argue that this is customer not understanding, which ties to marketing. I mean, pick your poison, but the result is when I look at the breach and attack simulation space, I see two value propositions. I can do technical controls validation very simplistically because I'm doing a checklist of things and then I'm replaying malicious traffic, in quote, malicious traffic. Um, and that allows me to see when something changes. The problem is that's not security. That is not what you're getting from a pen tester or a red teamer, which is a more realistic threat approach. And that matters because I'm going to give you even spicier. I think having now gotten a chance to see a number of enterprises that have had the opportunity, and opportunity probably be phrased differently as I complete this sentence, have had the opportunity to invest years in particular tooling. So it's like, hey, I bought this tool, in 2000. We have invested and built all of our defense around breach and attack simulation, and somebody shows up and runs a real test, and it goes through all of those preventative and detective controls like just like Swiss cheese. I mean, to me, that's malpractice. I'm sorry, you have been led astray and you have invested all of this time and money not making your company more secure at all. All you've done is shown some really nice MITRE attack heat maps and we're like, we're cool.
yeah. And we see that too. And so there's a number of reasons why that actually happens. I think that part of the reason why that happens is a number of organizations, whenever they're dealing with vulnerabilities, they treat that kind of BAS tool output as a Nessus output, right? Like we need to fix this, we need to fix this thing, we need to fix this thing. And they're not focusing on the alerting side of it, right? You shouldn't be using BAS tooling to find vulnerabilities in your organization. You should be using it to determine and validate your alert logic, like alerting logic in your SIM. So is your EDR working? Okay, let's take EDR out of the picture. Are we ingesting sysmon logs? Are those sysmon logs being processed properly? Is the WEC-WEF dying on a regular basis? We see that constantly. Is your queuing failing? Like if you're using Kafka or something, is it actually working properly? Or are you dropping logs at a certain rate? You need to be testing your entire detection methodology all the way through. So usually where we see it fail is we see companies that are trying to fix the individual vulnerabilities, but they're not focusing on the detection and the alerting logic on the ass end. So what we do is we do it with our SOC is we have this continuous series of scripts that execute, and then it checks back into the SIM constantly. And it's saying, hey, was an alert generated for this? Yes. Okay, good. Was there an alert generated for this? Okay, good. Was there an alert generated for this? No, that becomes an issue for the SOC to actually focus on at that point. So I think whenever I see that on the pen testing side, they're trying to look at the output of these tools, not as something that's exercising the blue team, but they're trying to look at it as a vulnerability management problem, like an Easter egg hunt. Once we fix or identify all the vulnerabilities that the BAS tool identified, we're secure. And that's why red teams are able to go through these things as well.
Yeah, I also want to pick on something that you talked about there with queuing and Kafka. I see again sort of capping the BAS conversation on technical controls validation starts with visibility to logging to making sure that I have centralized my logging so that I can start to build alerts. The challenge there is that the alerts you're going to build are so simplistic. That's the gap there. The second part about it, and to be fair, there are very few organizations that have achieved this maturity level, but this is where you want to go, is what you were just talking about there with the queuing, is the timing of all of this. We are still so focused on visibility because it's the configuration management foundation of our security. We're not even yet to the point of understanding that timing of these things is critical, right? Just because an alert was fired doesn't do me any good if it took 9 hours to get to my SOC. And
Yeah.
that's a thing. And that's going to be a lot of folks who are like, well, my EDR caught this, or my EDR didn't catch this, or this is how I compare EDRs. Well, guess what? EDRs, I've seen organizations have to choose an EDR which had less visibility, but because they had more reliable timing that they were able to tie to it. And what I've seen once you've got past that visibility component, it turns out dwell time of a threat actor is the greatest correlation to impact. And so that's where we want to go. So, question in from the audience that I think kind of takes us to the next level here. What are some of the challenges in purple teaming that you have come across? And do you find this paradigm shift away from just blue and red teaming to a facilitated growth in improving threat assessment and analysis?
I need to kind of springboard what you were just talking about and
Okay.
this question and kind of bridge the two, because I'm gonna explain this in a story. You were talking about, a lot of the different detects that people put in place. They can detect that thing. We had a customer where we did an assumed compromise assessment. We went through a bunch of tests, did a bunch of things, and a whole bunch of alerts didn't fire. And we sat down and we worked with the customer. And we looked at their alert, like their actual signatures and their detects that they had in play. And a whole bunch of their alerts and detects literally had the path to atomic red team in them. So what that means is their analysts literally wrote a signature that if you see this PowerShell and in there it says atomic red team, generate an alert, and they said, we're now covered underneath that MITRE technique. That's bad, right? They were writing a very, very, very brittle, specific signature for a specific tool that was being used to exercise the blue team. And it provided no value, because as soon as an attacker wasn't, attacking and setting up a directory of atomic red team, then it was completely falling apart. So when you're seeing this, kind of what Bryson just talked about, when people are writing alerts, far too often they're writing an alert for the very specific thing that the attacker or the pen tester or the purple team did. And they're not stepping back and saying, okay, what is the crux of this technique? Is it run DLL using script object, pulling down a .set file? Can we write a signature around that? How do we write our signatures in such a way so that they're robust to be able to detect these types of things? So that's where I see this falling flat on its face. People just start writing alerts based on like specifically what the attacker did. It's very similar to web application security assessments, where people were like, all right, so the attacker used a SQL injection attack for 1 = 1 semicolon dash dash, right? Apostrophe or 1 = 1 semicolon dash dash. We're going to put in a signature for that. And we're going to detect that. Great, we're good on SQL injection. The attacker then just changes it to 2 = 2 and blows right on through the signature. We're seeing those exact same mistakes being made again and again and again. And we're not really learning the way that we need to.
Okay. So now going to the purple team question. What are some of the challenges in purple teaming that you have come across? And do you find this paradigm shift away from just blue and red teaming to a facilitated growth in improving threat assessments and analysis?
So I would say some big problems that I see on purple teaming is you have two groups of customers that truly want to work together and find their problems. And this is the same thing as any red team or anything that we normally do. And then you have customers that want a clean bill of health. There are customers that are like, we're going to give you the system. It's completely locked down. The configuration is completely different than anything else in our environment. It's set up the way that we want it to be set up. We've got the EDR set up that's not deployed anywhere in our entire organization. We've got it completely isolated from a VLAN perspective, which is awesome. You should be doing that, but that's not how it's set up in the rest of the environment. They bring you in and they say, go. And it's not a realistic exercise. Basically, it's the same thing that we've seen with pen testing for years, where people are not allowing the test to actually work within the environment as it actually exists.
So obviously not going to add anything to what John said other than I think it has facilitated growth and improving threat
Oh,
assessment and
absolutely.
analysis. And here's why, and proof of how we believe in it is if you go, we put out a risk assessment maturity model, and we actually moved purple teaming up to the front. And the reason for that is when we were originally putting this together over a number of years, because we are some of the originals to creating the purple teaming concept, was the idea that you needed red teaming before you needed purple teaming. And why we flipped that is because we think that purple teaming is actually an easier way to building to a more sophisticated red team function. The educational and training aspects that come out of purple teaming, the demonstrable process improvements that you get as an outcome from the exercise, make it easier to justify the program and to build that maturity. Because chances are, if you don't already have a red team, explaining and justifying that budget to the executive team is going to be a challenge. And so that's a way that the process naturally builds up to getting to there. There are a number of cheap or free options to getting started with it. My recommendation is Atomic Red Team. There are three components you can control around an exercise: the complexity, the scope, and the frequency. So when you're getting started, start with a simple scope. Let's just look at a gold image to understand what's happening on that box. Let's do a really simple thing with Atomic Red Team, and let's just do that once to get started and get a feel for it. The frequency is important because the process maturity of running a purple team itself is a capability. We get so focused on the tooling to drive the offensive signal, we get lost in the fact that this is an organizational process that requires collaboration and to do it well and to be able to communicate all those pieces out of it.
Absolutely.
Okay. For organizations just starting with offensive testing, is purple teaming a first step kind of practice? Well, so I just answered
Just kind of
that.
answered that. Yeah.
Um, okay, there was a question in the chat that I was trying to get into the Q&A because it got pushed across. Let's see where to go. Okay. Do you feel there are too many tools out there? And the tooling we're talking about is offensive tooling. So the scanners, vulnerability assessment, pen testing tools, red teaming tools. Do you feel there are too many tools out there where your customers and the average business are unable to conduct threat simulations and pen tests successfully, regularly without outside guidance?
So I don't see a problem in the offensive tooling side. I don't think that that bothers me all that much because offensive people write tools. That's what they do. And the reason why offensive people write tools is because that's the way a lot of offensive people understand a problem. So if you take somebody who's really, really, really good at what they do to understand something, they will literally write a tool around that thing. And that doesn't bother me. What bothers me is on the defensive side, especially whenever you're dealing with cloud security technologies, the amount of products and vendors out there for like container security, cloud security, CASB, access brokers, all of that stuff, it's insane. And very rarely do we see those products whenever we're doing a pen test actually come into play and impact our offensive security assessments. And that's, I know this isn't a cloud conversation, but there's all of these products in the cloud space. I don't see them impacting what we're doing on our security assessments. I'm really, really curious how widespread they're actually deployed, or is it just lots of companies that get lots of VC funding and don't have many customers? And that gets into a whole nother series of rants. So no, people are going to write tools on the offensive side. It's just the way that we do things. The defensive side is what has me spooked because there's a lot of products that just don't have track records and a lot of them that don't make sense to me at all.
And I'm trying to do too many things at once. Okay. How do you balance starting simple with a consequence-driven approach? Structuring your PT and AE. I'm guessing purple team, and I'm not sure what AE stands for. So, folks, please don't use acronyms. Spell out what you're asking around your most
This is
business
this is
mission.
coming from a guy that came up through the military. So please don't use acronyms because we're going
Yeah.
to get it wrong.
So,
So
how do you balance starting simple with a consequence driven approach? I'm going to summarize that as I think structuring your risk assessments around your most business mission critical processes and systems. I'm going to start off with I think you almost answered it in your question.
I think so too.
Going back to where I started in risk assessments, I always say circle the wagons around what matters most. If you don't know what matters most, you can't defend anything. Not all of your enterprise is created equal. Different users, different assets at different times have different value. The second order effect, and this is where I really see penetration testing falling flat, is we tend to look at just a system in isolation. And the reality is that's why it's a network. So if you're not thinking of a system of systems approach, you're missing it. And this is why in a lot of my talks, I go back to the Sands Casino fish tank, because it's a perfect example of a low value target that was high value because of its proximity to things of value. And so when we're circling the wagons, it is understanding what is most important, what has access to what's most important, and that's where we're starting to establish control, and then more importantly, monitoring and overwatch around what should be choke points to that.
And I kind of I'm starting to look at pen testing as more of I don't want to say a thought exercise, but it's more a validation of the different processes, policies, and procedures in an organization than it is an actual engineering activities. And let me explain that. When you come in and you're doing a pen test, we're kind of very quickly, we're looking at, what are the ways that we can get in? How do we get in? And then a lot of that gets basically templated off of the blue team and what they are not doing. And ultimately it falls down to policies and processes and procedures, which is weird because a lot of people look at red teaming as like, it's this really technical thing, but the output should be an update to a policy, process, and procedure. So if we're able to get in through an unpatched system, your patching policies have failed. If we're able to get in through a user clicking a link and putting in all of their information, then your user awareness training has failed. So you're basically tying it back to these policies, processes, and procedures, and that sort of space. Whenever you're doing BAS, you're actually doing engineering, and it should be something that you're doing continuous. I hate using BAS, but all right. Whenever you're doing adversarial emulation, you're actually doing engineering and validation of those controls. And it should not be like, we did this once per year. Ideally, it should be something that's running daily because we see firewall rules that break alert logic. We see group policy that goes out and breaks EDRs. We see WEC-WEFs fail all the time under loads. I mentioned dealing with Kafka and all those different things. These are problems that creep up in an organization that is a dynamic organization. And as part of good engineering, you should have controls to validate that these things are constantly working. And you mentioned Atomic Red Team. And I know SCYTHE incorporates Atomic Red Team. It's awesome. But it doesn't lend itself really well to like a continuous adversarial emulation validation. So it's great to start there, get some value out of it, but you really want to work it up to something that's happening continuously in your environment. And it shouldn't be this fire that's like just in the hands of the security people. You should have it all the way through your entire stack. So your network engineers, your systems engineers, your DevOps team have that capability of running these things as well.
John, you are on our advisory board, and you haven't actually been briefed on our latest roadmap, but you literally just actually gave our latest roadmap. That's our goal. Is we started with basically building an enterprise red team tool. We have been working. That's why we pushed the purple teaming process, because it was a way to overcome the deficits in red teaming to communication and fixing and a lot of that process. And our view actually is our platform should be what we call middleware for malware. And the idea being is anybody in any part of the organization should be able to drive their own testing, not just thinking from a security view of, hey, I need to be building detections and validating this efficiency for my SOC, improving my vulnerability management, but I'm a sysadmin and I'm about to push out a configuration. Why shouldn't I be able to do a quick security validation of that in a very simple way where I'm using the tools I already know, and I'm just able to have this thing automate on the back end to be able to conduct some limited risk testing for that insight, which is more than we've ever had today. So, John, thank you for not knowing it, but just briefing our roadmap. That's what we're trying to build.
Sounds good.
Michael, as orgs create more security teams, who should be included in purple teams, SOC and red team, and then Vul management, Intel, and others?
All of them.
So I will go even beyond that. So first of all, again, being process maturity, start simple. Simplistically, of course, the reason that it's called purple is it's red plus blue equals purple. And that's as simple as you need. You need to drive a functional signal to then being able to improve some understanding of your security. If you add threat intelligence there, then you're starting to drive that signal with more of an understanding of what's coming from your own space. That's a lot of what our analysts do for you as well. But think broader than that. I look to things like the security champions idea that security shouldn't be in this alone, and we want folks that represent other functional interests that aren't in security or even in IT to be a part of this, because this is where in security, how often do we complain, hey, you should have involved us earlier? Well, a security champions approach does that, and why not include that in your purple teaming process once you've gotten a few exercises under your belt to bring in HR or finance or a business operations point of contact to be a part of understanding the threat, building that plan up, and then getting to see it. I think we take it for granted because it's our job, just how cool that can actually be. Um, All right, directly for you, John, on unrealistic pen test environments. So this is, of course, the industry-wide debate on scope, I believe. Thoughts on how to qualify this in a report? Do you say something like this was 2 out of 5 stars in terms of realism, point in time in a dev environment, for example? I'd love to have some way to call this out up front.
So you just basically identify exactly where your starting point was, and kind of the limitations of the environment. To getting to a more common issue about that. So let's talk two different issues. One, let's talk about operational preparedness for testing, right? There's a bunch of tests that we do where the organization is not ready for a test, right? Like we get in, let's say a web app, it's not running, it's crashing constantly. Call it out in the report. There's nothing wrong with that, right? If you're going to look at scope, that scope should be identified at the beginning of the test, not at the end. But the end of the test and the report should clearly harken back to the scope, where you started, what you did, and why you started at a specific point that you did. And that's done for two reasons. One, to make it very clear in the report to the auditors what it is that you did and what you didn't do, but also making it very clear if something happens outside of that scope, that it's not your fault. An example would be, we had an external red team that we did for our organization. They established the scope of what we were allowed to do. We went after that scope, had success, many like critical and high vulnerabilities, and we worked with that customer to fix it. A number of months later, they had a Google Cloud compute environment that they were building at that time that was not in scope. They finished it, it got hacked because there were externally facing APIs. They were able to get compromised through that. That was out of our scope. Now, that whole entire thing could have been a negative experience. The customer could have came to us and said, why didn't you find this? It could have gotten ugly. It didn't, because we clearly identified the scope at the beginning. We clearly identified the scope in the report. Then it wasn't an issue. So the best way to handle all of this is documenting and having good conversations up front, throughout, and at the end of the test. And then you don't get into big arguments. But whenever you're talking about realism and what the test does, if we have a customer that's actually got us locked down in a specific environment, if that's all that we're able to see, and by the way, that thing is incredibly rare whenever that happens, then we clearly identify these were the technical controls in the environment that we had. Now, if that customer gets breached, it's very quick and easy for us to say, well, did you have all these technical controls in place? And they'll be like, well, it wasn't on a separate VLAN. We didn't have the EDR that we had for you. So you can deal with those problems later whenever you have good documentation about what you actually encountered in that test. But I would say the vast majority of the time, it's not that big of a deal, especially if you establish really solid scope and rules of engagement on the onset of the test. You stick within that scope and rules of engagement, and you document it in the report, because that's the artifact that's being left behind. It works great.
How do you stay informed and current on emerging security threats without feeling inundated, which I believe that captures the feeling of all of us in security across the board. We live every day with the existential anxiety of whatever we've done. We're not sure whether it worked or not. And then the constant inundation of information. Where do I start? What do I do? The threat's constantly changing. What do I got to worry about? And how do you evaluate the potential value of emerging security technologies?
I'm going to say the fundamentals. I don't get really distracted by the exploit du jour, right? Because a lot of the exploits that are coming out, they're basically rehashes of the exact same types of problems that show up. So what we did, I had a bunch of interns that sat down and we were going through all the findings that we had. When we have a findings tool that tracks how often different findings show up in different tests and different types of environments by market vertical. And we realized that there's like 10 different things that an organization can do that'll stop like 98% of the different types of attacks that we do in an organization. If you focus on those core fundamentals, keep your stuff patched and up to date, enable two-factor authentication absolutely everywhere, use a solid, good EDR, use a SIM with good telemetry and validate that that SIM is working with adversarial emulation. Like there's like 10 things. And if you do these 10 things, you're going to be okay. If you look at a lot of the organizations that get popped, a bunch of them are not doing good vulnerability management. They're not having pen tests done. They don't have two-factor authentication enabled. They're not doing web application vulnerability assessments. When you boil it down, constantly it's something stupid that gets someone. It's not like, this heartbleed or, cutting edge new 0-day for privilege escalation that's popping organizations. Don't get distracted by the noise. Stick with the core fundamentals.
So I simplify, and I'm actually have started to decide that I need to trademark my model here. So it's Bryson's attack model. Bam. There's 3 phases to an attack that you care about. Reconnaissance, I'm collecting your information. Initial access, I'm getting in, and this is where we get caught up. So what John was talking about, that's all initial access. How do I gain access in? I've picked the lock, the door opens. That's all that's happened so far. And then the third phase is effects. This is where I'm actually doing all the things to you. You as a defender have control over this because it's your assets talking your way. And from an attack perspective, they're limited as well because they can only talk the ways that you've allowed protocols in that environment on the assets that you have. Again, going back again repeatedly to why configuration management is so important. The point summarizing all of this is 1, on the initial access stuff, you'll never win. The perimeter is dead. And it's mostly not technical. I mean, we know that users are the largest risk surface area. Now, I'm not saying go and yell at the users, but I am saying that's how you need to do your security architecture, recognizing that the users will fail. If a user fails and it takes you down, that's security's fault, not the user's fault. Second part of that, on effects. If you look at the attack chains of what's happening with the code that's dropped afterwards, so I've got access, however I did, I got shell, the code I'm dropping now as an attacker to do what I want to do, well, turns out there's only so many ways that they want to do that. Now, I'm not saying there's, test this technique and you can block off an entire MITRE attack column, but I am saying that if you start to look at a state-based approach of how these TTPs build up and you compare in real-world threat intelligence, campaign to campaign, there's actually very little novelty. And so what I would suggest is a fundamental process, as John said, of vulnerability management and effective purple teaming, where I'm really getting to a TTP basis, not trying to check MITRE attack like a bingo card, not running a BAS checklist, but actually doing this stuff over time. You will be able to cut the noise out because you're driving it for your environment with a high quality test.
And I kind of want to springboard on that, like the 3 points. The initial access, just to let you know what's going on in the pen testing community, all of the EDRs can be bypassed, okay, for initial access. It's still not that hard to get on an endpoint, all right, and bypassing for initial access and getting initial command and control up and running, all right. However, with the EDRs, once you start doing damage or you start moving laterally, you try to pivot and escalate your persistence mechanisms in that environment, it's getting really difficult, okay? So there's some improvements that are actually happening out there, but what's happening now is you have all of these organizations that have great telemetry, they have all this stuff that's set up, it's looking amazing if they're in a protected environment. As organizations are starting to move to a more cloud-based remote work, all of these different things, a whole bunch of those protections are not as effective if somebody's in their computer system and their victim is at a home network. So things are constantly changing dynamically, but I think that very, very quick, simple model works exceedingly well to kind of state where we're at in the offensive capability space right now.
All right, we're out of time. So John, last things that you would like to leave everybody with.
I would just like to come back to focus on the basics and fundamentals. And, when we're looking at the adversarial emulation space, this is a huge blind spot. And I want to make it very, very crystal clear that I can tell customers when we're doing pen tests who are doing this and the customers who are not doing this. The customers who are doing this, their networks, yes, we can get in. We can get on the EDR, absolutely. But as soon as we start moving off of that endpoint, we get our asses handed to us because they're constantly testing and evaluating not just vulnerability scan data, but post-exploitation communications with their EDR back to their SIM, and they're making sure that their telemetry is working. Organizations that are not doing this, we're still playing the game with them with like, we had no idea that that technique was a thing. They can't keep up. You can't keep up with all the post-exploitation techniques that are out there. Oh, if you want an absolute basics definition, I've got a pay what you can class that I'm starting next week. Zero is an option. It's called Getting Started in Security. Just Google my name, John Strand, pay what you can. It'll take you right to the class. $0 is an option. You don't have to pay anything, or you can pay something. I honestly don't care. Just show up next week and we'll talk about it.
I will second that. We have been partners with SCYTHE, which is the training arm that John has been talking about. And I think it is an example again of where he and I both are really good at, in quote, sucking at capitalism, but more importantly, helping the community. Because at the end of the day, I know I personally believe that just because you've built Fort Knox at your company, well, this is the reason that supply chain risk has been in the news as much as it has, because all of the insecurity around you brings you down. And so if we can't help by strategically leveling the playing field with helping more of us understand the basics to the more the advanced to helping make the community better, then it really doesn't do a lot of good to be an expert of one when we need to be a community together with security.
Absolutely.
Um, and we've got a little bit more time actually, John, because we're still waiting for Edgar to show up. Let's go in. Yeah, there was a good one I wanted to pull out on EDR if I can find it. I first of all, one, thank you all for throwing all the questions in. This has been, you have overwhelmed us with questions, which is a good place to be in. Just because your question is not asked does not mean you are not entered into the raffle. Reminder to everyone and the folks still joining us, please put it in the formal Q&A part on the right side of the menu as opposed to the chat, which is just nobody can track the chat, so I can't do all three of those things at once.
So
John,
I've got a question. Harlan popped up. He said, do you bypass EDR or do you avoid alerting because the telemetry is collected, but there's no detection specific to that technique? Whenever you're getting initial access, there's a number of different ways that you can get initial code execution. I want you to look at it, and Harlan's like super smart, I know. But whenever you're looking at your EDR and what it's actually monitoring, whenever you're actually running malware, there's a problem. Your computer is designed to execute code. It is a general purpose computing platform, whether it's a Windows system or a Linux system, Macs to a lesser extent, but still it is a general purpose platform. So it wants to execute code. That's what it does. So code is executing in a variety of different ways. And you can actually do a number of different things that makes your malware look different, and you can bypass it, right? Let me give you a better example of like EDR bypass, just to give you an example, blind spots. Right now, most organizations allow .rdp files to come into their environment. Email gateways allow them through. There just doesn't care about .rdp files because they're not executables. They're configurations for remote desktop protocol. So right now, one of the initial access techniques that we use at Black Hills Information Security that works exceptionally well is we send somebody a .rdp file. And we basically say, hey, click this file to access this thing, treat it as though it's an executable. A user double clicks that and it opens up an RDP session to one of our RDP servers. And in that configuration file, it basically says, mount a share that is bidirectional. So now our attacker, our pen tester, can actually get that RDP session and automatically load malware on the customer's computer system, and it's all done over RDP. That would be an example of a bypass technique. And if you want to, go check your email filters. You shouldn't allow .rdp files in your environment. Just don't. We're gonna have a webcast talking about it. But those are the types of bypass techniques where we're identifying gray areas that we can leverage to bypass those products because they're basically ignoring them. There you go.
all right, John, thank you so much for joining me this morning. And like I said, I think you and I should be doing this on an annual event. We didn't get to quite go as broad ranged as we did at San Diego with looking at industry.
We need the uniforms. It's the costumes, man. Whenever we get the costumes, something comes out.
I actually think we need more time.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So we should probably do this either more frequently or for a longer period of time. But again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Take care.